thank you very much, and I'm glad to be back here again. I was just reminded that I did give a talk here along with one of my colleagues many years ago, I think on one of my first trips to Brazil. But for those of you who don't know me, I have been running an economic consultancy based in Beijing since 2002. Because of the rapidly growing economic relationship between Brazil and China in the early 2000s, we developed a very large and loyal following here in Sao Paulo and Rio. And so for the last 8 or 9 years, I've been coming once each year to make the rounds, to talk to our clients. And we always do one significant public event in Sao Paulo and another one in Rio. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to share some thoughts with a wider audience. I realize it's not quite as much wider as we hoped it would be because of the rain, but we'll do our best. So thank you all very much for coming here and braving the weather to discuss this very interesting topic. So I've titled my talk, Learning to Live with U.S.-China Strategic Rivalry. And what that means is that, first of all, we are moving, I think, from a period where the U.S.-China relationship was a complicated one, but in most respects a fundamentally cooperative one, to an era where the amount of cooperation is probably going to go down quite a lot, and the amount of rivalry and competition is going to go up. And I think this is partly the result of the election that we had in the United States a year and a half ago and the rise of Donald Trump, but it's only partly as a result of that. I think my conversations with policymakers and think tank people in Washington make it very clear that even if someone else had gotten elected, there would have been a major shift in the U.S. relationship with China. There's a strong consensus in Washington that the previous method of engaging with China was not producing the desired results, and that a very different and much tougher strategy is required. So I stress that what's going on right now is not a short-term thing that depends on a particular set of personalities, but I think it's a long-term shift in this relationship, which, because we're talking about the two biggest economies in the world and the two primary sources of demand and of trade and investment, trading volumes and investment capital for the rest of the world, this shift is something that really concerns everyone. And it's something that we're going to have to live with for a very long time, regardless of whether there's any change in the particular personalities involved. So what I want to start out with is a discussion of China's domestic position, because I think this is, first of all, it's very newsworthy. We've just had a Chinese People's Congress that has created a lot of important headlines and a lot of significant changes. But I think it is also very important to understand very clearly what is going on in China, both on the political and the economic front, and how that has contributed to the more tense relations with the United States, and how China's position affects the ability of the United States to achieve its aims. Right? So there are two broad points that we're going to discuss today. One is that China's domestic position is extremely strong. We have an economy that went through a rocky patch 2 or 3 years ago, but is now back on a very stable footing, largely, not entirely, but largely because of quite successful government policies. Financial risk, which was a major concern of many people in the market over the last 2 years, has been contained. They haven't gotten rid of it, but they've definitely reduced the likelihood that there will be some kind of bad financial accident in China. Politically, Xi Jinping has established a very strong position for himself and, more importantly, is trying to institute an entirely new governance system in China from the one that we've been used to for the last 25 or 30 years, and one that will be much more effective at implementing policies that are set at the top of the system. And because the economic and the political system are now quite stable, this means that the top leadership can devote less of their attention to managing sort of day-to-day problems and more of their attention to managing China's strategic aims for the next 10, 20, or 30 years. And I've highlighted two strategic programs that China has that I think are highly relevant. One is called Made in China 2025, which is a comprehensive industrial policy with very ambitious aims. And the second is, I think, one that I've discussed before in public meetings here in Brazil, and you should be all familiar with. It's the Belt and Road Program, which is essentially China's vision for how it fits into the rest of the world and how the rest of the world will be made to fit in with Chinese aims. So that will be the first part of my remarks. The second part will be a discussion of what's going on in the United States, how the U.S. views China, and the political forces in America that are shaping this more intense rivalry with a very strong and resilient China. Okay, so when we look at China, obviously the headlines of the moment are about politics, for good reason. Last October, we had the once every 5 years Congress of the Communist Party. And two notable things occurred at that Congress. Number one, Xi Jinping, who had just completed his first term as party chairman and state president, managed to elevate a lot of his associates and followers into senior positions in the leadership. And second, he did not indicate any successor. And this was a break with past practice, because normally the expectation would be that Xi Jinping would serve 2 terms. After the second term, he would give way to a successor, and that successor would be nominated or indicated at the midpoint of Xi's term in office. But he did not do that, and so that created a lot of speculation that maybe he was planning to, by some way, extend his own time in office. And now we've had the National People's Congress, which just concluded today. And indeed, at the very opening of that conference, we were presented with a constitutional amendment which abolished the 2-term limit for state president. And so this opens the door for Xi Jinping to be president as long as he wants to be. So that was a very important shift. But there was another important constitutional amendment that was introduced at the same time, which has received much less attention, but which I think is at least as important as the abolition of term limits. And this was an amendment which essentially subjected all public servants in China, all public sector officials at every level of government and in state-owned enterprises, to party discipline, and not just for corruption issues, but for any kind of disobedience to central policies. So it used to be basically, if you were a party member serving in government, the Party Discipline Commission could come after you if you were found to be corrupt or stealing money or something like that. But if you were simply not enacting central government policies or modifying them in some way to deal with local conditions, there was no mechanism for punishing officials that were disobedient in that way. And now there is, and it's in the Constitution. So basically, if you ignore, it's called corruption by omission. If you ignore central government edicts or rules and you don't enforce them the way that you're supposed to, you can be punished quite severely. And this is really, really very important. And I think completely turns on its head the system of governance that we have seen evolve in China over the last 25 or 30 years. So I want to dwell on this for a moment because it's a really important point. So historically, the way that China has worked, at least since the early 1980s when the reform and opening period began under Deng Xiaoping, is that in a formal sense, the government was centralized. It's not a federal system. They're different states, but they have no independence, and they operate in a pyramid with the central government at the top. So in a formal sense, China is a highly centralized system. But in practice, it was highly decentralized because the reality was officials at the provincial, the prefectural, the township, the city level, the emperor was very far away in Beijing. He would send down sort of a general instruction about what needed to happen. And then local officials had a lot of discretion about how they interpreted these rules and how they implemented them. And most people who have studied China over the years, including myself, have said this was actually a great strength of the Chinese system because instead of having a few out-of-touch leaders sitting at the top sending out edicts, you had a lot of local experimentation. Officials at the local level who understood local conditions could adapt the general policies to suit whatever the needs were. And they could sometimes do things that moved beyond what the central government had in mind. And because there was a lot of tolerance for local experimentation and innovation, some of these experiments that worked could then be moved up and made more general national policies. So it was this decentralized authoritarianism, as it's often been called, was a very effective way of generating information about local conditions and the policy responses that work, and feeding that information up to higher levels, right? So it created a much more flexible governance system and one that was much more responsive to the needs of the people than was typically the case in communist countries. And it was very, very different, almost the diametric opposite of the Soviet system in Russia and in the Soviet Union, which was highly centralized, very rigid, and where there was very little autonomy for local officials to move within the dictates of the central government. So now we have Xi Jinping coming along and saying, actually, this is a bad idea. We don't want this. We have a big problem that local governments are not doing what the central government is telling them to do, so we're going to change the Constitution, and we're going to make it much more difficult for local officials to have any kind of discretion or authority. And so one interpretation of this is that this is a really bad idea, that he's making China more like the old Soviet system. He's trying to impose centralization on a gigantic country that's the same size as physically as Brazil or the United States and has 4 times the population of the United States. It really doesn't make sense for that to be a highly centralized system. So there is an interpretation that this is a very negative, backward step. I think there's another possible interpretation that we should consider seriously, which is that Xi Jinping and his colleagues, including his Vice President Wang Qishan, I think have been considering China's governance challenges quite seriously and carefully for a long time. And they're quite sophisticated thinkers. And I don't think that they're doing this simply because they have a simple-minded view that more central control is always better. I think their analysis is something like this, that China had gotten to a point 5 years ago when Xi Jinping took over where the authority, not only of local governments, but of people who are running state-owned enterprises, had become too strong. There were too many vested interests that were able to do their own thing without reference to national priorities, and that were creating a risk that the Chinese system would fall apart because it was controlled not by a government that was acting in the interests of the people, but because it was acting in the interests of these small groups. And so therefore you needed a more disciplined system. But I think there's a second element which has not been talked about, and I'm really speculating here, but I think my suspicion is my speculations are on firm ground. I described one of the benefits of the decentralized governance system as creating information flow. And my analysis of the reason why China has been so much more economically successful than most other post-communist states, including notably the Soviet Union, and why they've been able to sustain Communist Party rule under a more dynamic economic structure. The reason for that is that the governance system in China is a very, very effective information processing machine. And there are a lot of mechanisms that enable information to flow up from the grassroots up to the central level, where it's converted into policy. The policies trickle down. They're then modified and changed according to local conditions. And then the process repeats itself. Based on those experiments, more information flows up and so forth. So the key point here is that information flows were good. The key point is not that the government was decentralized. Decentralization was a mechanism to create better information flow. And I suspect that one of the reasons that Xi Jinping is willing to go for a more centralized and controlled political system is that he now has a different mechanism for information flow, and it's called the internet. So everyone in China almost is connected to the internet by a cell phone now, and they are constantly interacting on social media. They're doing a lot of their purchases via the internet on their cell phones. Online retailing is much larger as a share of total retailing in China than it is in the United States, for example. And so there's just a gigantic amount of information that's floating around in the internet. And of course, because this is China, ultimately there is no privacy for data. So all of the data that exists in social media and commercial websites and so forth is accessible in principle to the government. And the government is putting a lot of money into artificial intelligence research, which will make it much easier to aggregate this data and put it to use. And there are also things like there are surveillance cameras everywhere in China and so forth. But I think the key game changer here is the internet. So I think if you're Xi Jinping and Wang Qishan and you see this problem of vested interest and see this problem that the central government keeps issuing these policies and the policies get blocked and they aren't executed, and you start thinking, well, we actually don't need the local governments to perform this information gathering function anymore because we have so many other online resources for doing that. So we can rely on the internet and other mechanisms to keep the information flowing so we're still in touch. And then the role of local governments is changed. They're no longer as important as part of this information process. And what they really need to be done, what they really need to do is focus on implementing policy. So I think that's the bet that's being taken, that it is okay to re-centralize government and put the local authorities on a much tighter leash. And that's not going to cause the government as a whole to fall out of touch with the needs of the population because there's so much information flowing around so much more easily than was the case even 10 years ago. So it's a calculated gamble in that sense, that it's okay to create a more rigid, centralized governance structure, but this will not be damaging to the ability of the government to respond to what's going on. And I think there are some respects in which you can, in some respects this is creepy, but in some respects I think you can sympathize with these desires. Take one example, air pollution, okay? It is the experience of every country in the world that air pollution or any kind of pollution is not a problem that can be solved by local governments, because local governments almost always have a greater incentive to promote economic growth, or they can be bought off by the polluting enterprise. Or in the case of air pollution, they can do things, they emit the pollution in one locality, but then it drifts off to somewhere else, so the people in that locality don't care about the pollution that was created there because it's not their problem. So pollution is a governance problem which has to be addressed by a higher, more centralized authority. And if you don't have a way either to coordinate or to mandate policy at a higher level, you can't control pollution. And it is the case that the environmental protection has become a much bigger part of the agenda of the government. It's now one of the top 3 challenges that Xi Jinping has identified as being the things that the government should focus on over the next 3 years, the others being financial risk and poverty. So if you're going to really solve the environmental protection problem, you need to have an ability to discipline local governments. And the decentralized system that China had in the past does not work. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about jumping to the conclusion that what we're seeing under Xi Jinping is simply the creation of centralized, personalized rule for no other purpose than a power grab. I think there is a thoughtful governance agenda behind it, or I would like at least to present that possibility to you. This brings me to a second point, which is that when we think about Xi as an authoritarian leader who has just given himself an indefinite term in office, I think comparisons often spring up to other leaders like Vladimir Putin who have basically done the same thing. And as my lengthy discussion of Xi's governance agenda should indicate, I actually don't buy that. I think if you look at most other authoritarian leaders, they don't have this kind of vision of national governance. They have a much more personal agenda that's basically about protecting themselves and protecting their cronies. It can work as long as that person is very strong, but then after that person becomes weak or leaves power, then the system becomes very unstable. I think Xi Jinping is aware of this, and I think what he is trying to do is not just extend his own personal time in power. I think he has this broader institutional agenda to create a strong, resilient governance system for China that will outlast him. So that's my take on the politics of China. I'll make a couple of comments on the economics, not too complicated. The basic point I want to make is that 3 years ago, China was in a very difficult position. Many sectors and regions of China were effectively in recession. There was capital flight. There was a stock market crash. And there was a sense among many observers, including myself, that the Chinese leadership had lost its ability to manage the economy. 3 years later, those doubts have been put to rest because we've had a very successful recovery. And this recovery benefited to a significant degree from the global recovery that we've had since the beginning of 2016. But I think, first of all, that global recovery was in no small part initiated by China's successful response to its problems. And more broadly, I think a lot of the credit for China's recovery belongs with domestic policy. And a very simple point about how this was achieved. On the one hand, the government stimulated demand by loosening credit. That's a very standard part of the Chinese playbook. And it's fine to do, but there's usually a hangover afterwards. But they didn't stop there. They also had a supply-side policy, and the supply-side policy was to restrict the supply of steel, cement, coal, and other key raw materials. So they were pushing up aggregate demand. They were constraining or pushing down aggregate supply. The result was an increase in the prices of many industrial products. And this meant that corporations went from losing money to having much stronger revenues and much stronger profitability. This meant that they didn't have to take on so much debt to finance their operations. Their retained earnings did not go into new investments because they weren't allowed to invest in new things unless they were really necessary. So they retained the earnings and strengthened their balance sheets. And so it was a very successful two-sided intervention in the economy. Then on top of that, at the beginning of 2017, right about a year ago when I was in Brazil last time, the government recognized that the credit stimulus part of this solution was getting out of control. And there was a real risk that financial risk-taking was so large that it would cause a crisis. So they started a crackdown on risky financial speculation and significantly reduced credit growth. But they managed to slow credit growth without slowing the economy, which is quite unusual. Usually when you tighten credit, the economy slows down. Here they tightened credit by quite a lot. Credit growth went from 17% to 12% in the space of a little over a year. but the economy kept going on at the same pace. And the reason they were able to do this is that they were very skillful at targeting which parts of the financial system were risky and which were not. And they closed off the shadow banking and the funding of speculation in financial markets and commodity markets that was sucking up a lot of credit, but was not actually generating productive economic growth. So they took the bad part of credit and they said no more of that, but the good part of credit, which was going to households to finance mortgages or consumption, and or to corporations to finance new productive ventures, not more steel plants, but new internet ventures or technology firms. And they said that kind of credit, that's fine. You can keep doing that. In fact, we want more of that. So we've seen very successful management that has put China's economy on a more stable footing and has really reduced dramatically the financial risks. So that's, I think, the baseline that we have. What about China's longer-term ambitions? As I mentioned, there are two strategic plans that I want to address. One is Made in China 2025, and the other is the Belt and Road. Made in China 2025 is an industrial policy program that was announced in 2015, and it has three broad aims. One is quite conventional. Basically, they want to improve the productivity of manufacturing and industry throughout China by getting companies to use information technology in a better way. And this is something that a lot of companies throughout the world have been doing on their own. It's something that the German government, for example, has been promoting under its Industry 4.0 program. This is something that pretty much everyone is doing. It's very non-controversial. The next two aims, however, are much more problematic. The second part of Made in China 2025 is large-scale subsidies to Chinese firms to develop capacity in new technology-intensive industries such as robotics, artificial intelligence, biomedicine, electric vehicles, and so forth. And this is industrial policy as we know it. The government saying we want to build these industries domestically and we're going to subsidize to a huge amount to enable this to occur. And that makes a lot of China's trade partners not so happy. The third is a clear import substitution agenda. Right now, China depends a lot on imported technology components and materials, and they want 70% of these basic components and materials to be domestically produced by 2025. And then when you look at each of these individual sectors that they're targeting, they have specific targets for the domestic share domestic companies' market share of these different industries as well. And the clear intention is just to take a lot of things where they're reliant on imports and create domestic companies that can allow them to stop importing these things. And again, if you are exporting products, machinery, technology products into China, you're not very happy with this because your market is going to be taken away. This is a plan. Why should we take it seriously? Lots of
only Chinese companies or foreign companies based in China?
That is unclear, and that is one of the things that foreign companies want to get clarity on, because they're perfectly happy to sit in China and produce these things for the Chinese market and take the subsidies that the Chinese government is giving. And if that's the deal, then I think many foreign companies don't have a problem with that. But it is vague, whether domestic means domestically owned or domestically based. And we have a lot of elements from Chinese industrial policy that in the past that make us suspect that a lot of it means domestically owned, not just domestically based. But that is a point of non-clarity. Thank you for bringing that up. So we need to take this seriously because there's a lot of money behind it. So China already is the second largest spender on research and development in the world, behind the United States. Most of that is not by the government, it's by corporations. On top of this spending, the government has launched within the last 3 years what they call venture funds. The cynical way of thinking about these is these are subsidies by a different name. So instead of taking $10 billion and subsidizing a semiconductor plant, for example, what the government is now doing is they're taking $10 billion and they're giving it to an asset manager of a venture fund, And they tell the asset manager, now you take this money and you invest it in semiconductor startups that you think are viable, and your job is to make a commercial return on this investment. So the theory is that you have more market incentives to get things right, rather than just the government throwing money into things. The amount of money that has been earmarked for these funds is enormous. It's over $300 billion. Not all of that money has actually been committed to these funds. About a third of that, $130 billion, is earmarked for semiconductors. And $35 billion of that has actually already been deployed. There are, right now, as we speak, there are 3 large semiconductor plants under construction in central China, costing $35 billion, all funded by these government venture funds. So when you have this massive industrial policy that seems to have a lot of import substitution and mercantilist objectives, and it's funded by huge amounts of capital coming from the state, that's a matter of concern. And the third point is that on top of this Made in China 2025 program, we have a separate initiative, which however is linked, which is the military-civilian integration initiative. So China is very concerned that unlike the United States, it does not have a very good system for having technology developed in the private sector be adapted for military uses, or vice versa. The two systems are siloed. So Xi Jinping has made it a priority and has set up a party commission to ensure that there's better integration between civilian and military technology. And a lot of this has to do with artificial intelligence, which clearly has a lot of potential use in command and control systems for militaries. So if you're looking at this from outside, you say, they've got this big industrial policy program, which might be bad for foreign companies. They've got a lot of money behind it, and they're going to try and use this to beef up their military. Should we not be concerned about that? I think the answer is no, we should be concerned about that. Particularly because if you look at other aspects of the way China organizes itself, it is highly protectionist. So I've picked one thing here. We tend to think of China as being a place that has a lot of foreign direct investment, which is true, but that's because it's a big country, not because it's particularly open. This is an index that the OECD has compiled of barriers to direct investment for different countries. You can see the OECD average. Do I have a pointer here that works? Yes. The OECD average is very low, and most OECD countries are kind of in that zone. Most major developing countries have higher barriers to investment, but Brazil actually is quite open, relatively speaking. China is off the charts. It is just much more closed to investment outside of a handful of manufacturing sectors than anyone else. So they have big barriers to investment. They have big barriers to imports, which are mostly not tariffs. Their tariff rates are low, but they have a lot of non-tariff barriers that are very difficult to get around. So looking at this from the standpoint of the United States or the European Union or any other country that wants to have beneficial trade and investment relationships with China, Made in China 2025 looks like it could be potentially a big problem. So the second initiative, and this map did not show up very well in the Africa has kind of gotten washed out of this. But anyway, I think you'll get the point. The Belt and Road, as you probably all know, is this plan to build connective infrastructure between China and various other places. And the Belt refers to this stuff going from Western China through Central Asia into Europe. It basically has two aims. One is to facilitate resource extraction, oil, gas, and minerals from Central Asia, bring them back to China via road and rail and pipeline. And then the other is to connect manufacturers in Western China with markets in Europe by an overland route, which I think is a little bit kookier, but anyway, that's their idea. That is the new Silk Road economic belt. The road, weirdly, is on the ocean. It's a little hard to see in it, but it's this blue map, this blue line that goes from the South China Sea into the Bay of Bengal through the Indian Ocean and back into the Middle East. That is the new Silk Road, the new maritime Silk Road. And the idea there is to connect China with markets, particularly in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, in better ways, to improve port infrastructure. And there's also some resource extraction. There's some natural gas offshore in the Bay of Bengal, which Myanmar has access to, and so they're building a pipeline that will carry that natural gas from Myanmar up into China. So how do we think about the Belt and Road? I think it's really, really important not to think of it as just like a giant infrastructure project, because that's not what it is. It is, in international relation terms, a grand strategy. This is a picture of how China wants to interact with the rest of the world. And I think the best way to understand it is by comparing it to what the United States did after World War II. So after World War II, the United States had two strategic objectives. They had sort of gotten entangled in the world because of two world wars. There was no way out. So they had two objectives. Number one, no more world wars. Number two, contain the expansion of communism. And a sort of a condition was that they didn't want to have a colonial empire, A, because they were ideologically against it, and B, because that was really expensive. So how do you meet these objectives? Well, the grand strategy that the United States came up with was, the economic dimension of it, was to create a sort of a free market, liberal economic order, which was bound together by a set of essentially agreements, treaties, free trade arrangements, investment treaties, and so forth. And basically the idea was to get as many countries as possible to participate in these very favorable economic arrangements. Through free trade and investment and access to the U.S. market, these countries could grow their economies very quickly. Hopefully they would also, in the end, adopt a sort of a more U.S.-style governance, democracy. We made some exceptions for that, clearly, during the Cold War. But the idea behind it was that by creating these connections, these economic connections across the world, you would promote economic growth, economic integration, and the development of a network of countries that were friendly to U.S. interests. And because the U.S. was basically writing the rules for this system and providing the market of first and last resort, the U.S. was really the hub of the system and exerted most of the power in it. And it was spectacularly successful. We've had 7 decades of extraordinary economic growth, largely as the result of this system. And it's been very beneficial for the United States in terms of its ability to project and exercise power around the world. So the U.S. had this very successful grand strategy that worked both on the economic and the political front. China, in a couple of words, wants the same thing. They are trying to do exactly the same thing. They've said, we've now built our own economy. We now have to engage more internationally. And we could choose to be a junior partner in the American system, but that doesn't really seem all that attractive. So we're going to create our own mechanism. And the idea is the same. We create economic linkages which promote economic growth. This is beneficial for peace because the more linkages, economic linkages countries have, the more costly it is to go to war. So we don't want a war. And because we have the ability to finance all of these physical links and to build them, we will decide where they go, and we will be able to build these linkages according to our strategic aims, and we will gain political and economic influence in exactly the same way that the U.S. did after World War II. It's exactly the same idea. The only difference is that the U.S. executed this through essentially legal agreements and treaties and rules. China is not so interested in rules. They're executing this strategy through physical connections. But it's conceptually the same thing. And I think the fundamental question is, the one that I've posed at the bottom of this slide, does the Chinese system act as a complement to the U.S. system, and do they sort of fit together in a useful way, or are they conflict and compete? My own perspective on this is that it's actually very hard for the Belt and Road to work as well as it should unless it complements the existing rule-based system. Because you can build all the roads and pipelines and whatever that you want, but if you don't have a robust system of rules to govern trade flows and investments, that infrastructure is not going to deliver as much economic gain as it otherwise could. So I think the optimal solution is that you have both of these things operating in tandem, and then I think that can be quite beneficial. I think a problem that we see is that the U.S. is very reluctant to share power with China in this way, and will seek to limit or contain China's ability to execute on these plans. So there's a risk there. Yeah, sure.
Before you move on to the U.S. The system that they're planning will generate so much data.
Yes.
Are they institutionally capable of processing this volume of data?
That is a very interesting question. Okay, so the question, if you didn't hear it, was that the Belt and Road system that they're talking about will generate so much data. Is China institutionally capable of processing all that data? So I would actually add to that question, first of all, are they actually going to collect this data in a good way? And then do they have the processing capability to deal with it? Excellent questions. I don't think there's a clear answer to that. I'll give you one example of how this could work, right, in a very simple sense. One of the best ways to keep track of construction activity in China today is through software developed by the Komatsu Corporation, which is a Japanese a producer of construction equipment. Every piece of construction equipment that they sell anywhere in the world has software in it that tracks how and when it's being used. So, and all this data goes back to Komatsu headquarters, and they compile an index of the number of hours that their construction equipment is being used in China, for example. So if you don't believe the Chinese construction statistics, and there are sometimes good reasons for not doing that, you can go to the Komatsu database and see are the earth movers and the bulldozers and the front loaders being used the way that the Chinese data say they are. Right? And sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. So your point is that as China starts to do all of this stuff, in theory, they could generate not only that kind of information, but other vast amounts of information based on all these projects that they are developing. So I think one question is, do they have the capability of generating and collecting this information systematically? My judgment would be right now probably not, because I don't think their companies are as advanced as Komatsu is, for example, in these kinds of IT systems. Second, even when they do, it's likely to be a bit more fragmented. So that creates an analysis problem. And three, I think no, at the moment, the processing capability at the central level in China is not up to it. But this is why they're investing a lot in artificial intelligence, because if you have artificial intelligence systems, the analysis of all of this data becomes much easier, right? So I think there's an aspiration, probably, to get exactly where you're suggesting that they might go. But they don't have the capacity yet. And I don't think they're terribly close to it yet. Okay, so maybe I've scared you a little bit. Now I'll scare you some more, because I'm going to start talking about Donald Trump. So what we've had over the course of the last couple of years is a realization, in the United States, that the past methods for interacting with China were no longer adequate, and a new playbook was necessary. And I stress this is not an idea that Donald Trump had. This is an idea that is shared basically by everyone in the entire foreign policy establishment in Washington, Democrat, Republican, Independent, doesn't matter where you're coming from. They see the rise of China. They see that China has not become a democracy like many people hoped it would. It's not moving in that direction. In fact, it's moving in the opposite direction to more authoritarianism. And so the whole bet of U.S. policy vis-a-vis China over the last 25 years, that by engaging them in the global system, China would become more like those other countries, it kind of hasn't paid off. So we need something new. What is that something new? That's where the debate comes in. But I think within the Trump administration, there were 4 forces that you needed to pay attention to. We're now down to 3 because one of them has been ushered out of the room. So the 4 forces were, first of all, President Trump himself, who is not a strategic thinker, someone who likes to promote chaos and shake things up and has some visceral attitudes towards trade. But he's the president, so his say matters a lot. Second, there's the faction that I've labeled here the trade warriors. So these are people in the trade bureaucracy in the United States who feel that we need to take a much stronger line. And then the third is national security hawks. So these are basically all the generals that Trump has appointed to run the National Security Council, the Defense Department, and now the State Department. And the fourth force was what you would call the globalist faction. These are people who wanted essentially a continuation of traditional U.S. International economic policies. These were represented by Gary Cohn, the National Economic Council chief, who has now resigned because of the decision to impose steel tariffs. So that globalist faction, I think, is now out the door. So we really only have to think about these 3. And what we've seen is a very rapid shift after a year of there not being anything in terms of the protectionism and the tariffs and all of these things that Trump had campaigned on. We're now starting to see this stuff happen very rapidly. We had tariffs on solar panels and washing machines last month. Then we had large tariffs on steel and aluminum. At the end of this week, we're going to get very large tariffs on Chinese technology products being exported into the United States. So things are happening very rapidly. And I think the reason that this is happening is that there is a kind of a convergence of interest between the trade warrior faction and the national security faction, that China is a big problem for all of the reasons that I've just suggested, and that the U.S. needs to take a much more aggressive approach, verging on what you could call a technological or economic Cold War, with the aim of containing China's rise and preventing it ever from becoming a more robust competitor to the U.S. for global economic and political leadership. So that's a pretty big agenda. The trade people and the national security people do not always agree. The steel tariffs were a good example. The trade people wanted steel tariffs. The national security people did not want them. And the reason they did not want them was because they felt that the United States needs allies in its battle against China. And they knew that the steel tariffs were going to hurt U.S. allies way more than they were going to hurt China. So they said, wait, we want to get our friends together with us to beat up on China. Why are we beating up on our friends? This doesn't make any sense. So they opposed those tariffs, but Trump likes tariffs. He's been demanding tariffs. So he said, go ahead, do the tariffs, right? So there are, these forces are not 100% aligned, but they do agree that China is a big bad guy and that they need to be dealt with. So what have we seen so far? Well, number one, we've seen a series of strategy documents coming out that identify China for the first time as a strategic competitor. Second, we've had the trade officials go to China and say, your job is to cut the trade surplus, your trade surplus with the United States by $100 billion, or about a quarter, which is not obvious how the Chinese can do this. So, and then third, we have these Section 301 sanctions that are coming up. Fourth, we've already seen the Investment Review Board in the United States, CFIUS, block several investment transactions by Chinese firms in the United States. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Chinese firms will not be permitted to buy any kind of U.S. technological asset. And the mandate of CFIUS could be broadened by legislation in extraordinary ways. The current legislation says that CFIUS should start looking not just at merger and acquisitions, but at all investments, including greenfield, not just investments by foreign companies in the United States, but investments by United States companies in other countries. And they broaden the definition of national security. So if the legislation that is right now in Congress passes in its current form, which I think it won't, fortunately, but if it did, CFIUS would go from handling about 100 cases a year, which is a very small number, to several thousand. So this would be a very big change in the way that the U.S. handles foreign investment. It's targeted at China, but it could be used against other countries as well. Other things are being talked about. The director of the FBI has got up in front of Congress and publicly stated that every single Chinese student in U.S. universities today, of which there are 300,000, is a potential national security risk. Okay, does anyone hear Joe McCarthy's voice echoing in the background? I do. There is a potential for restricting the ability of U.S. companies to hire Chinese workers to work in technical jobs in the United States, and on and on and on. So the point I want to make is the headlines are now all about trade war, and the U.S. is going to put on tariffs, and China might respond with tariffs. And my point to you is that this is potentially much bigger than trade war. This is not about the U.S. doing some negotiations so that China will let in more beef or soybeans or more banks to do business in China. This is a strategic rivalry situation where the security hawks are saying we are in a zero-sum competition with China for technological superiority. We must win this race. And to do this, we must deny China access to U.S. technology, and we must increase our own efforts. And the trade warriors are saying, basically, we have a whole system of economic organization in China, which is the emblem of which is Made in China 2025, which is highly protectionist, very unfair, and we want China to change that system, because the only way that China could actually reduce its trade surplus with the United States by that amount is by completely changing its mechanisms of industrial organization and economic policy. So the aim here is very large. It is not small, it is not narrow, and it's not restricted to trade. I have various other charts. I've talked for a long time, and I'm going to skip over this stuff because I want to get into some discussion. I just want to briefly conclude with some ideas about, I've laid out a kind of a fairly gloomy scenario here. What potentially could happen, right? So I think it's very clear that the U.S. is committed to taking very strong trade actions against China, both on the trade front and the investment front. China, I think, will have to respond in certain ways. They will almost certainly respond to the Section 301 tariffs by suing the United States in the WTO, because there's a lot of legal precedent to suggest that Section 301 is in fact illegal under WTO rules. They will probably pick some things to do tit-for-tat tariffs on things like soybeans, where you can always find a health reason to restrict soybean imports from a particular country. They might slow down the Boeing order book for airplanes. They might target certain industries or companies that are prominent in politically important states for Trump, like Pennsylvania and Michigan. So they'll do some of that, but I think the bigger game for China is to look like the good guy. And I think they're going to be very restrained and very careful, and they will do everything that they can to present themselves as an upholder of the global system, not as a disruptor of it. And I'll give you one simple example of how they've played this card just in the last couple of days. Bob Lighthizer from the USTR has been going around to U.S. allies, including Europe, and saying, okay, we have threatened to put these steel tariffs on you, but actually, we won't if you agree to this list of demands that we have. And there are 5 things, one of which is ally with us for beating up on China. And so that was sent last week to the European Union. Perhaps not coincidentally, Angela Merkel happened to have a phone call with Xi Jinping after that over the weekend. And after that phone call, they released a joint statement saying, oh, Germany and China pledged to work together under the G20 to negotiate a solution to steel excess capacity. And that sure as heck sounds to me like Angela Merkel giving the finger to Bob Lighthizer and saying, you want to come and extort cooperation out of me by threatening my steel industry? Good luck. I'm not going to play ball with you. And it looks like China taking this opportunity to say, look, you're unhappy about our steel excess capacity? We'll talk. We'll deal. We're happy to, as reasonable people, negotiate with other reasonable people for a, as they like to say, win-win solution to this. So I think that was a very carefully contrived publicity move by China to position itself as we're responsible stakeholders in the global order. We want to play by the rules. If you have problems, we'll negotiate, but we won't respond to threats and intimidation. I think that's their message. So I think in the short term, this is good for the global economy because what it means is that we will not have this escalation of U.S. putting on a lot of tariffs and China putting on more tariffs and then the U.S. responding with more. That could be very destructive. I don't think that's going to happen because I think China will be restrained. So the immediate impacts of this rivalry, I think this year will be fairly modest. There will be a lot of headlines, a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of discussion. But if we look at actual impact on economic activity and trade flows and investment, I think it'll probably be modest, other than in the specific sectors that get targeted. So that's the good news. I think the other thing to think about is that essentially what I've presented here is kind of a worst case scenario of what could happen. But a lot of things can change. We have midterm elections coming up in the United States that could change the political dynamic in the U.S. Quite a bit. Trump could get impeached, for example. He could be thrown out of office before the end of his term. That's not a big possibility, but it's more than zero. You could have business interests and Republicans in Congress who are basically want free trade rising up in opposition to this and watering down a lot of these things. A lot of things could happen. It's very uncertain. What I've tried to describe to you is what I think are the underlying tectonic forces at work in terms of China's rise and U.S. anxiety about that, and the political forces at work in Washington to try and shape this debate, and some possible outcomes. But I think how this actually plays out will depend a lot on many things that we don't know yet. And I'm still retain some hope that there are enough people, both in the U.S., in China, and in other countries, who realize that if you go too far down this road, then the entire global system of trade and investment from which we all benefit could be put under threat. And therefore, it's worth working very hard to preserve what we have, but also to impose some accountability on China, in particular, to play within the rules of the system and not stack the deck as much in favor of its domestic firms and its domestic interests as it seems to want to do at the moment. So I've talked much longer than I planned to. I hope it was interesting, and I hope we still have a few minutes for some discussion. Thank you very much.